I remember the sound before I remember the sight, the sound of thousands of men breathing the same thick summer air, each breath sharp with nerves and sweat, and something else I still can't name. Dawn had not yet broken, but the sky above us held that strange bruised blue shade that comes just before the world decides whether it's ready for light. Mist clung to the tall Virginia grass, coiling around our boots and legs like ghost fingers trying to slow us down, trying to whisper a warning. But warnings meant nothing now. We were already too far in. I stood with my rifle propped against my shoulder, staring across the field where the morning fog thickened into pale walls that hid everything beyond it. Trees loomed in the distance like dark giants, oaks and pines standing silent, drenched in the fading night. Somewhere behind them lay Bull Run Creek, winding through the valleys like a sluggish serpent. And beyond that, somewhere beyond the curtain of haze and dawn, lay thousands of Confederate soldiers waiting for us. I could feel them even if I couldn't see them. Every man around me shifted, coughed, cleared his throat, adjusted his pack, or wiped his palms against his trousers, little movements betraying the truth that none of us were ready for what was coming. We were boys pretending to be soldiers. Clerks, farmers, factory hands, apprentices, immigrants with broken English, men who had never fired a shot in anger and now stood in line waiting to march into the first great battle of the war. War. The word still felt foreign, too big, too terrible to fit inside my head. When I enlisted, everyone said it would be quick. One bold strike, they promised. One strong march, one decisive fight. Home by autumn. Mothers believed it. Sweethearts believed it. Even we, standing in the streets of Washington with new boots and polished rifles, believed it. But now, standing in the damp chill of this Virginia field, listening to the distant rumble of artillery wheels being dragged into position, I realized something I'd been afraid to admit. War wasn't going to be clean. It wasn't going to be quick. And none of us truly understood what we had signed up for. A faint orange glow began to creep along the horizon. It stained the fog with streaks of pale gold, making the blades of grass shimmer like wet steel. In that eerie light, the farmland around us slowly revealed itself, the wooden fences leaning with age, the small farmhouse with its boarded windows, the worn path cutting through the fields where wagons had once carried crops instead of cannon shells. This land had seen quiet seasons. It had heard laughter and harvest songs. Now it would hear screams. My heart thudded uncomfortably in my chest. I forced myself to breathe slow, steady, just as the sergeant had taught us during drills, but the air tasted of damp earth and gun oil, and every breath felt like I was swallowing a stone. My fingers brushed the rough strap of my cartridge box. I didn't feel ready. I wondered if anyone did. Behind me, two men whispered. "You think they'll run?" one asked. His voice cracked like a boy's. The other answered, "I think we might." The honesty of it stabbed through the air like a blade. I didn't turn. I didn't want to see the fear in their eyes, not when I was struggling to hide my own. Major Simmons walked past us then, his boots crunching softly through the wet grass. He was a stern man, angular in the face, with deep-set eyes that seemed carved from iron. He said nothing as he inspected the line, but the way he nodded once, brief, almost reluctant, made my throat tighten. We were all he had. And he knew it. From somewhere beyond the trees came the low, distant roll of a rebel drum. One heartbeat later, another answered it from farther down the line. It felt like the earth itself was beginning to stir, waking up to witness what men were about to do to one another. I lifted my canteen and took a sip of warm, metallic-tasting water. My hands trembled, just enough for me to feel, not enough for anyone else to notice. I hoped. The sky brightened further. The fog thinned in patches, revealing more of the rolling hills that formed the battlefield ahead, soft and peaceful in appearance, like a painting. It struck me then, painfully, that nature had no idea what we were about to do. The birds chirped somewhere along the tree-line. A breeze stirred the leaves. A rabbit darted through the brush, unaware of the thousands of rifles pointed toward its home. War belonged to men alone. The order to stand ready echoed down the line. Rifles clicked. Bayonets glinted faintly in the newborn light. A collective breath swept through us like the rising hiss of a tide. I swallowed hard, my mouth suddenly dry. This was it. Bull Run. The first real test. The moment when the stories and speeches ended, and what remained was only blood, and grit, and whatever courage we could scrape from our trembling hearts. When the bugle call finally pierced the morning air, high and sharp like a blade cutting through the sky, I felt something shift inside me, something heavy, something final. The kind of feeling you get when stepping through a doorway you know you can never return through. We began to march. And with each step through the wet grass, each crunch of soil beneath our boots, each breath drawn into lungs that wanted to run rather than fight, I knew one truth with absolute clarity. No matter how this day ended, none of us would ever be the same again. I barely slept the night before we were ordered forward. The air in camp felt different somehow, thicker, heavier, like the darkness itself knew what tomorrow held. Every sound echoed louder than it should have, the creak of a wagon wheel settling in the cold, the snort of a horse tied to a post, the whisper of wind brushing through canvas tents. Even the fire seemed to burn with restraint, its flames low and cautious, as if it didn't want to draw too much attention. I lay on my blanket staring at the faint glow of the embers outside, trying to quiet the restlessness twisting through my stomach. The ground beneath me was hard, uneven, scattered with roots that pressed into my ribs no matter how I shifted. But the discomfort wasn't what kept me awake. It was the knowledge that this might be the last night I ever felt the earth under me. The last time I'd lie awake thinking about home, about faces I hadn't seen in months, about promises half kept and letters waiting to be written. Around me, the men breathed in soft, uneven rhythms. Some muttered in their sleep, wrestling with whatever dreams, or nightmares, claimed them. Others sat awake like me, silhouettes hunched over knees, staring blankly at nothing. A few smoked quietly, the glow of their pipes flickering like red stars in the darkness. Nobody spoke unless they had to. We all understood the silence, because inside it, our thoughts were loud enough. I kept thinking about the road that had brought us here, how only months ago I'd been working the fields back home, hands in the soil, sweat on my brow, listening to the wind roll through the tall grass. Back then, war had seemed distant, like a storm on someone else's horizon. But now that storm was here, hanging over us like a great shadow ready to break open. The landscape around our camp was still visible in the moonlight, the slopes of gentle hills folding into one another, the pale shimmer of Bull Run itself twisting like a silver thread through the trees beyond. You'd never guess an army was hiding on the far side. The land looked peaceful, almost tender in the way it rested under the night sky. It felt wrong, like looking at a sleeping child knowing it'll wake to screams. At some point, I rose and walked a few steps beyond the circle of tents. My breath came out in white wisps that drifted upward, dissolving into the darkness. I listened to the night, trying to absorb whatever calm it had left to offer. The sky was clear, stars sharp and bright above us. Somewhere in the distance an owl called out, a long, hollow sound that stretched across the fields like a warning. I thought of my mother, my father, my brothers. I wondered if they were looking at the same sky, if they felt the same unease I felt now. I tried to picture my mother in the doorway of our home, hands folded against her apron, waiting for news she feared to hear. That thought tightened something inside my chest. Back near the fire, someone began humming a tune, soft, low, trembling slightly at the edges. A hymn, maybe? Or a lullaby. It floated through the camp like a fragile thread, connecting us all in our shared uncertainty. For a moment, it almost soothed me. Almost. But then the wind shifted, carrying with it a faint, distant rumble. Not thunder. Not wagons. Something heavier. Something rhythmic. Artillery wheels, maybe? Or troops on the move. The sound barely reached our ears, but when it did, the humming stopped. Every man froze, listening. Waiting. The noise faded as quickly as it had come, swallowed by the darkness again. But the damage was done. Whatever fragile piece we'd held onto slipped through our fingers. I returned to my blanket, but sleep never found me. The sky slowly lightened, the stars retreating one by one as dawn crept in. That moment, the quiet transition from night to day, felt like standing on a threshold, one foot in the world I knew and the other in a world I didn't understand yet. When the first rays of sunlight touched the camp, casting long shadows across the ground, I finally rose. My legs felt stiff, my joints sore, but there was no time to think about that. The call came down the line, sharp and clear. "Up and ready! We march soon!" Those words cut through the stillness, ringing in my ears long after the officer moved on. I tightened my belt, slung my rifle over my shoulder, and tried to steady my breathing. The night of waiting was over. Now we would see what daylight would bring. The morning after our arrival felt strangely calm, too calm for men who knew they were standing on the edge of something terrible. Dew clung to every blade of grass like 1,000 tiny mirrors, catching the pale light of dawn and scattering it across the fields. It was beautiful, and the way quiet things are beautiful when you know they won't stay that way for long. We stood in formation before breakfast, shivering more from nerves than from the chill. Some of the boys tried to act hardened, cracking jokes, squinting toward the horizon like they expected the Confederates to come charging out of the tree line, but their voices betrayed them. Even the bravest among us spoke with a kind of forced steadiness, like actors in a play they didn't fully believe in. While the sergeants barked orders, my mind kept drifting. I found myself studying the rolling landscape ahead, the soft swells of Virginia farmland, patches of wheat curling in the wind, the line of trees marking Bull Run somewhere beyond. Smoke curled absently from a farmhouse chimney off in the distance, rising in a thin column that looked too peaceful, too domestic, for what this land was about to witness. I wondered who lived there. Whether they were hiding inside, listening for the tramp of boots or the rumble of artillery. Whether they hated us, feared us, or simply wished we'd all go away so they could reclaim their lives. War didn't just divide soldiers. It carved lines through families, neighborhoods, fields that once fed both sides alike. After roll call we crowded around the cook fires. The coffee was weak, the hardtack harder, but nobody complained. Eating kept our hands busy. Thinking too much was dangerous. Beside me, Private Leary rubbed his thumb across the small wooden cross he wore around his neck. He didn't talk much, but that morning he whispered something under his breath, maybe a prayer, maybe a memory, and I felt the weight of it settle between us. Other men pulled out letters from home, some worn soft from countless readings. Others stared into the flames as if trying to memorize the way they moved. Me? I watched the sunlight creep slowly across the ground, inching toward our camp. It felt like time itself was nervous, hesitant, afraid to push us closer to whatever waited beyond the rise. The officers came and went, their faces set in grim lines. They spoke to each other in low tones, always just out of earshot. But we didn't need to hear their words, the tension in their shoulders said enough. Somewhere out there, the Confederate Army was settling into its own positions, checking rifles, whispering their own prayers. Somewhere out there, other young men were watching the same rising sun and wondering if it would be the last they'd ever see. By midday, the heat settled over us like a blanket. Sweat rolled down the back of my neck beneath my collar. The air smelled of dust and horse sweat and the faint tang of gun oil. Every few minutes, a distant boom echoed across the countryside. Not cannon, just construction teams clearing trees and adjusting roads. But each blast made us flinch all the same. I tried distracting myself by cleaning my rifle. The metal felt cold against my palms despite the heat. My hands worked on instinct, ramrod, patch, powder, check the cap, movements drilled into me until they became second nature. But even routine didn't silence the unease in my chest. Around mid-afternoon, rumors swept through the camp like wind through dry grass. Some said the Confederates had reinforced their position. Others said we'd be marching within the hour. None of it was reliable, but every whisper tightened our nerves. The waiting, God, the waiting, was like being trapped in a room where the walls kept inching closer. Nothing to do but breathe and think and try not to imagine what musket balls would feel like tearing through flesh. Some men focused on chores to stay steady, others paced like animals in too small cages. I kept catching myself staring toward the distant ridge where the trees thickened. Somewhere behind that curtain of green, thousands of men were preparing to kill us. And yet the ridge itself looked so harmless, just sunlight on leaves, just shadows flickering in the breeze. Late in the afternoon, a courier galloped through camp, mud spraying from the horses' hooves. Conversations died instantly. We all watched the officer disappear into headquarters, our collective breath turning sharp and thin in our throats. That moment, the waiting after the courier vanished, was worse than anything that came before. You could feel the fear rising like a tide. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the wind seemed to quiet down, as if the world wanted to hear the decision too. When the officer finally reemerged, his expression unreadable, he mounted his horse and rode down the line of tents. The words he shouted were simple, direct, final. "Men, prepare to move at dawn!" My stomach dropped. The world seemed to tilt, not violently, but with a slow, deliberate heaviness, like fate itself was turning a page. The long wait was over. The storm was finally coming. The order to march rolled through the ranks like a sudden wind, snapping us out of whatever thoughts we'd clung to during the long night. One moment the camp was still, men stretching sore limbs and rubbing sleep from their eyes. The next, it erupted into motion, boots stomping the dirt, metal clanking, officers barking quick instructions, horses snorting as they were hitched to wagons. It all felt too fast, as if time itself had been waiting for us to blink so it could push us into the day. I tightened the straps of my haversack, feeling its familiar weight thump against my hip. Hardtack, salt pork, ammunition, a tin cup, everything rattled together like a restless spirit. My blanket rolls sat heavy across my shoulder, digging into muscle already tired from lack of sleep. The rifle in my hand felt colder than usual, the barrel catching the pale morning light. We formed into lines on the road just beyond camp, the dust still damp from the dew. The sunlight broke through the trees in soft rays, illuminating drifting smoke from the cook fires behind us. For one suspended moment, I looked at the place where we had slept, tents sagging slightly, embers glowing faint in the fire pits, gear scattered like the remnants of an abandoned village. It felt strange to leave it all behind, knowing full well we might never return. When the column finally began to move, the sound of thousands of boots striking soil became a kind of heartbeat. A slow, steady rhythm, one we all fell into whether we wanted to or not. As we advanced along the country road, the landscape opened around us, rolling fields edged by tall grass, farmhouses tucked beneath wide oak branches, fences leaning after years of wind and weather. The world almost looked peaceful. Almost. At one point, we passed a small farmhouse. A woman stood on the porch with a child clutching her skirt. She watched us in silence, her expression impossible to read from a distance. She could have been Union, Confederate, or simply someone caught between the two tides and praying both would move past her door. The child waved once. None of us waved back. I don't think we knew how anymore. The heat rose quickly as the morning deepened. My wool uniform grew heavier with each mile, sweat gathering beneath the straps across my shoulders. Dust lifted with every step, coating our boots and stinging our eyes. Yet none of us complained. None of us dared break the fragile sense of purpose that carried us forward. The conversation among the ranks was thin, short remarks, muttered questions, attempts at humor that fell flat. I overheard two men behind me talking about breakfast, of all things. One said he'd give anything for fresh bread instead of the rock-hard cubes rattling in his haversack. The other joked that if he survived the battle, he'd never eat salt pork again for as long as he lived. Mundane thoughts, desperate attempts to anchor ourselves to ordinary life while marching towards something extraordinary and terrifying. I kept mostly to myself. The rhythm of walking gave me too much time to think. Every mile we covered seemed to peel back another layer of doubt, exposing the raw fear beneath it. I wondered if the Confederate soldiers ahead of us felt the same way. If they marched now too, sweating under the same sun, thinking about their families, their homes, their mistakes. War had a way of making differences seem thin, almost invisible, except for the fact that soon, we'd be trying to kill each other. Around noon we stopped near a small creek to rest. I knelt to splash water on my face, watching the ripples distort my reflection. I barely recognized myself. My eyes looked older, shadows under them dark from worry and sleeplessness. My jaw clenched even when I tried to relax it. The creek water tasted of soil and silt, but it cooled my mouth and throat. Nearby, a few soldiers loosened their boots to rub sore feet. One man took out a pocket Bible, thumbed the pages, then held it closed against his forehead for a moment before slipping it back into his coat. Another sat with his back against a tree, staring up through the branches, lips moving silently as if talking to someone who wasn't there. I thought of all the people we'd left behind. I thought of all the lives ahead of us. There was a moment where I almost wished we could stay by that creek forever. Marching stopped, guns cold, the world paused in a rare breath of peace. But officers soon called us back into formation. And just like that, the world resumed its relentless pace. We continued toward the sound of distant thunder, not from the sky, but from guns firing somewhere far ahead. You could hear it faintly now, like a warning rolling along the horizon. Each muffled boom sent a shiver down my spine. Our steps didn't slow. They quickened. Because whether we were ready or not, the battle was waiting for us. The further we marched, the more the world seemed to tighten around us. The open fields gave way to clusters of dense woodland, tall trunks closing in on either side of the road like silent giants standing guard. The air shifted, cooler in the shadows, heavier too, as though even the forest understood where we were headed and mourned it. Our column stretched out ahead and behind, a long blue serpent winding through the trees. The road had narrowed to a beaten dirt path with deep wagon ruts carved into it, muddy in some patches, bone-dry in others. Every step sent small clouds of dust swirling up to mix with the smell of sweat, horsehair, and leather oil. Conversations grew even quieter. Even the birds seemed to hush as we passed, as if nature itself bowed its head. I walked near the center of the column. That was where the noise felt the most suffocating, boots striking earth, canteens clanking metal against metal, horses snorting, officers issuing clipped orders. Yet despite all the sound, no one spoke above a murmur. The closer we drew to Manassas, the heavier an invisible hand pressed against our chests. Every once in a while, I would glance off the road, half expecting to see gray uniforms watching us from the trees. But there was nothing. Just leaves shifting in the wind and low branches brushing against one another. At one point we passed a farmhouse that had clearly been abandoned in a hurry. The door hung open. A rocking chair lay tipped on its side on the porch. A broken lantern sat in the dirt, its glass shattered. A single boot lay in the yard beside a water pump. No people. No animals. Only the ghost of whatever life had existed there days before. One of the men muttered, "Rebels took it." Another replied, "Or they fled before we came." Neither explanation eased the tension. The wagon strained up a long slope, their wheels groaning under the load. Cannon crews marched alongside their guns, silent with the kind of focus that comes only when a man tries not to imagine what lies at the end of a journey. I watched the artillerymen walk, each one resting a hand now and then on the polished wood of the cannon carriage, almost like reassuring a stubborn mule. Or maybe reassuring themselves. The sun rose high enough for the heat to press down on us again, turning the road into a shallow river of dust that clung to our skin. Sweat trickled along my spine. My shirt stuck to my back. My collar rubbed my neck raw. But I kept walking because everyone around me did. Near mid-afternoon, the road curved along a ridge, and through a break in the trees we finally saw signs of the greater army gathering. Across the distant hills, blue tents dotted the landscape like patches stitched onto a quilt. Smoke from cook fires drifted lazily upward. The glint of sunlight off polished bayonets flashed like small stars. Thousands upon thousands of Union soldiers filled the countryside, a sight both comforting and terrifying. Comforting, because we weren't alone. Terrifying, because no one gathers an army this large unless they expect something monumental. A lieutenant riding past us paused long enough to shout, "Stay sharp, boys! Skirmishers reported enemy scouts not far north of here." That single sentence traveled down the line faster than any formal order. Men straightened their backs. Fingers adjusted grips on rifles. The joking and half-hearted chatter stopped entirely. The possibility of an encounter, of being fired upon before even reaching the field, settled like cold iron in our stomachs. The woods eventually thinned again, revealing stretches of farmland where fences had been torn down for firewood or cleared to make room for marching columns. A once beautiful meadow was now trampled flat, the tall grass crushed beneath thousands of boots. I stepped on wildflowers broken underfoot, and wondered how many years it would take for this land to forget what was coming. The further we went, the more the road became a living thing. It hummed with anticipation, vibrating beneath the pressure of men and horses and wagons. You could feel the motion of the army like the pulse of a great beast. Somewhere behind me a soldier coughed, a dry, rasping sound. Another cleared his throat. Someone's canteen slipped from his grasp and hit the ground with a dull thud. Tiny, ordinary noises that felt somehow too loud, too sharp against the growing quiet inside each of us. We were close now. Close enough that the officers no longer needed to warn us to stay alert. We felt it in our bones. The road ahead bent toward Manassas Junction, toward the rail lines, the ridges, the shallow streams. Toward the land where the first great clash of this war would carve itself into memory. And as I marched, my thoughts shifted. Hours earlier I had wondered whether we would be brave enough. Now I wondered something far more frightening. Would bravery even matter? Because the road was narrowing not just in the trees around us, but in fate. The choices that had brought us here were behind us. The steps remaining led only toward battle. Even if we turned back, the war would still find us. So we kept marching, one foot in front of the other, toward whatever waited beyond the next bend. Ready or not. We heard the battle before we even reached it. At first, it was just a low, rolling murmur, almost imperceptible, like distant thunder warning of a storm far away. My stomach clenched as I tilted my head, trying to locate the sound. But then it came again, sharper, heavier, rattling through the trees and dirt road beneath our boots. The vibration traveled up my legs, a tremor that spoke to something primal inside me. The men around me stiffened. The officers stiffened. Even the horses seemed to sense it. Boom. Another. Not thunder. Artillery. I could feel it in my chest. A deep, resonant warning that war had already begun, even as we still marched toward it. A hush fell over our ranks, silent except for the relentless beat of our own hearts. Somewhere, a rider shouted an order, and it bounced off the trees, barely reaching the men strung out along the dusty road. We quickened our pace, compelled by an invisible hand toward the smoke rising ahead. With every step, the air grew heavier, saturated with the acrid scent of gunpowder drifting across the fields. The distant popping of musket fire became audible, staccato, like the snapping of twigs under a giant's boot. I realized then the truth we had all tried to deny: men were dying now, just beyond those rolling hills. The ridge finally opened before us, and the battlefield revealed itself in a swirl of smoke and motion. It was chaos. Smoke curled in ragged spirals over green fields, punctuated by sudden bursts of flame as cannons roared. Lines of blue and gray collided in clashing waves, men falling and rising again in a dance of confusion and terror. Horses reared and screamed, dragging soldiers with them. Flags whipped violently in the wind, torn and smeared with dirt. The air was alive with shouts, cries of pain, and the relentless crack of gunfire. My hands shook as I gripped my rifle, knuckles white against the cold metal. Sweat burned my eyes, mixing with the grime on my face. I could barely focus, yet I tried to take it all in: the rolling hills, the smoke hanging like a shroud over the land, the shattered trees marking where artillery shells had ripped through. Each detail etched itself into my memory with painful clarity. A cannon erupted closer now, the blast shaking the ground beneath me. The force threw dirt into the air and knocked me slightly off balance. I caught sight of a soldier nearby, clutching his arm where blood ran through his fingers like ink bleeding on paper. He fell, muttering something I didn't understand. I wanted to help him, to pull him away, but my legs were frozen, anchored by fear and disbelief. The officers were shouting, trying to restore order, but their voices were swallowed by the roar of battle. Men tried to form lines, but the ground itself seemed to resist, churned into mud and debris from the relentless march and pounding hooves. I stumbled over a fallen musket, nearly crashing to the dirt, and caught myself just in time, heart hammering. Somewhere behind me, a young private, barely more than a boy, screamed as he dropped his rifle. He stumbled blindly into a shallow ditch, and I watched, frozen, as he disappeared from sight. Another soldier swore and ran past, dragging his friend who had been hit in the leg. I wanted to shout, to call someone's name, but my voice seemed locked inside my chest. Every step forward felt like a betrayal and a necessity at the same time. We were moving, advancing toward death, yet compelled by a strange, stubborn momentum that no man could resist. I could feel the sweat soaking my shirt, the heat of the sun pressing down, and the sting of smoke and powder filling my lungs. My ears rang with the explosions, my stomach churned with fear, and yet my legs moved. Step after step forward. Time became meaningless. Seconds stretched into minutes that felt like hours. The sounds of battle blended into a single, overwhelming presence, the roar of cannons, the screams of the wounded, the relentless march of men moving in every direction, some falling, some rising again. Each moment demanded everything from us: courage, instinct, survival. I caught a glimpse of the Confederate line ahead, gray uniforms crouched and firing, a wave of disciplined, deadly movement. Their eyes met mine for a heartbeat across the chaos, and for a single terrifying instant, we were nothing but targets to each other. And then the smoke swallowed them again. The officer nearest to me barked an order to advance. I raised my rifle, loaded, ready, feeling the cold weight of steel in my hands. The world had narrowed to the stretch of grass between me and the enemy, the smoke drifting over that small, cursed patch of land. My heart pounded in time with the distant cannon blasts. Each beat seemed louder than the last, echoing in my skull, in my chest, in every fiber of my being. And as the column surged forward into the roar, I realized this was no longer a story we had heard in books, no longer a drill we had trained for. This was the war. This was chaos. This was death made tangible. And there was no turning back. When the sun finally dipped low, sinking behind the distant ridges of Manassas, the battlefield of Bull Run looked nothing like the place we had marched into that morning. It was quieter now, not silent, never silent, but the furious roar of battle had faded into an eerie, uneven chorus of moans, shouts, and the low rumble of retreating artillery. I stood alone for a moment on a small rise overlooking the fields. Smoke drifted in thin, ragged coils from burned grass and broken caissons. The sky glowed orange, a color too warm for the cold that had settled into my bones. My hands shook, not from fear anymore, but from exhaustion so deep it felt carved into my muscles. Around me, the ground was littered with abandoned rifles, torn haversacks, dropped canteens, broken wheels, and scattered papers, letters from home trampled in the dirt, never to be read. The bodies. I forced my eyes away from the worst of it. Some sights a man can describe. Others stay behind your eyelids long after you close them. The wind carried voices, Union men calling for missing friends, Confederate wounded pleading for help, officers shouting for order. But all those voices seemed far away, like echoes from another world. The world before today. I sank onto a fallen fence rail, the wood splintered by musket fire. My uniform was stiff with sweat and powder. My throat felt raw from smoke and shouting. I hadn't eaten since before dawn. I couldn't remember the last time I'd felt truly steady on my feet. But beneath all of that, something else churned inside me. Something heavier. Something I didn't want to name. We had come here believing the war would be short. That one hard fight would send the rebels scattering. That we'd be home by fall. That we were marching into a page of history already written, already victorious. But standing there, surrounded by the chaos and ruin of Bull Run, those beliefs felt childish. Naive. Like something I'd whispered to myself in a dream I didn't understand. This wasn't going to be quick. This wasn't going to be easy. This wasn't going to end because anyone wished it so. War had shown us its true face today, and it was cruel, relentless, and far hungrier than any of us imagined. A captain passed by, blood on his sleeve, not his own. He paused when he saw me, his voice hoarse. "Get what rest you can, Private. We move again soon." Move again. So soon. My heart sank. But I pushed myself to my feet. As I did, I caught sight of the sky again, now streaked with the long shadows of dusk. For a moment, despite everything, it was strangely beautiful. The last light touched the smoke clouds, turning them gold around the edges. Like the day was trying to soften the horror it revealed. I closed my eyes and breathed in the evening air, mud, powder, sweat, death, fear. A scent I would never forget. A scent that told me the truth. Bull Run was only the beginning. When I opened my eyes, stretcher-bearers were moving past me, carrying the wounded. Artillerymen were dragging guns back into line. Officers were reorganizing what remained of their regiments. The army wasn't defeated, not in the way a storybook would show defeat. We were still standing. But something inside us had changed. The nation had changed. The war had started as an argument. Today, it became a promise. One written in blood. And though my legs trembled, I knew we would march again. We had to. Because whatever came next, more battles, more marches, more nights like this, was bigger than any one man's fear. As darkness settled fully and lanterns flickered to life across the field, I walked back toward my unit, each step slow and heavy. The road ahead was uncertain, brutal, unavoidable. But I would walk it. Because now I understood. This was not a single battle. This was the opening act of something vast and terrible. And the next episode of our story was waiting.